Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of our Great Books program as we convene in September and October our next book in our series. These next 2 months, I will be your host on the book by Erik Hoffer, The True Believer. And then in November and December, I will be back again for a book by Richard Dolan called AD, After Disclosure, which is exploring this extraordinary phenomenon of humanity's ET moment and how we cope and consider this momentous new information that is coming to our species. Now, Georg, I am in the little box on the top of the screen. I don't appear in the main video. Is there something wrong with my screen, or Georgie, am I appearing in full screen?
Yeah, you appear in full screen, Jim.
Okay, just wanted to check. So let's dive in. On Erik Hoffer, I was first introduced to Erik Hoffer when I was 15 years old. And I happened to pick up the book. I don't know how my family, or I guess it was my father, who was a voracious reader, had it. And I was enticed by the title. I was just coming of age during the Vietnam War and starting to read in politics and social affairs. And I saw this slender book by Erik Hoffer, who was called a longshoreman philosopher. And his book, The True Believer, absolutely fascinated me. And I've read it a number of times over the decades as I've been engaging in my own way in mass movements and in the front lines of social change, whether it was initially for the Vietnam War and the anti-nuclear movement, the climate change movement, et cetera, et cetera. I always remembered what Erik Hoffer taught me in this classic work, which was his first major book that established his fame as a philosopher. I'd like to start by recounting his life because he had such a full and extraordinarily interesting life. Many philosophers are born, in the middle class and the upper middle class. They're very refined, as Plato was, as Aristotle was, as John Locke and Heidegger and Kant. You think most of the philosophers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, they were all in either the middle or upper middle class, very well educated. Erik Hoffer was completely the opposite. And here's his story. He was born in 1902, or so we believe, because there was no birth certificate. It's just what he remembered later in life. He was born in New York. His parents were German. They had immigrated from Alsace in the late 1800s and found themselves in New York. And along came little Erik, and he was very precocious. When he was 2 years old, his mother, carrying him, fell down a flight of stairs. And she was injured and died a couple years later. And so Erik Hoffer experienced very early, while still a little toddler in his mother's arms, a traumatic experience that not only knocked him around and eventually caused blindness, but also out of it, he experienced his mother being handicapped and then dying when he was still a small child. His parents had spoken English and German in the home, and he learned both fluently at a very, very early age. And then when he was 7 years old, he went blind, completely out of the blue. No doubt, if someone like Gabor Mate was expostulating on these matters as a result of the trauma of falling down the stairs in his mother's arms and losing his mother, but he went blind. And then when he was 15 years old, just as suddenly as he went blind, he could see again. And the first thing he began to do after he could see again was to read voraciously. Although he never really went to school, he didn't go to higher education. He got a series of odd jobs while reading as voraciously as he could in the libraries and so forth and so on. To refine himself, he began to read more and more historically and philosophically, and then picked up Montaigne's essays, which, as I recall, Georgie Azabo, our Dean of Graduate Studies, spoke to last year. He was completely turned on to the philosophic life, but he didn't go into formal education. He was on Skid Row. He looked at the world and felt that it was so devastatingly boring and insipid and cruel that at one point he contemplated committing suicide. He then became a migrant worker and migrated across the United States in the 30s and the Great Depression, and had no particular purpose. Ended up in Los Angeles, and just parenthetically, my own parents, my father, born in 1917, also became migrant workers. And if you've read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, about the life of the migrant workers in the 1930s after the Great Depression of 1929, you get a sense of what Erik Hoffer was experiencing in this sad, shiftless, pointless existence, all the while reading voraciously. And then all of a sudden, he began to realize that he'd collected rather, an enormous body of wisdom and insight, and that he could write. He became aware that he could communicate effectively, even though he was working at the time as a longshoreman, on the docks, just loading and unloading ships. And so he wrote a novel originally. And then in 1964, he wrote a little book on the true believer as he was reflecting on the buildup and aftermath of the Second World War, where, as you remember, the Nazis took hold in Germany in the 1930s, and the conflagration of National Socialism completely overwhelmed the collective consciousness of Germany. The Bolshevik Revolution beginning in 1917 into the 1920s in Russia that created the Soviet Union was another mass movement, and the impact of the Nazis and the Bolsheviks on the world was a stunning event. And the question that Hannah Arendt in her book on totalitarianism and many others were asking at that time in the aftermath of the Second World War is, how on earth did this happen? How did Russia, steeped in czarist Russian Orthodox ideology, get caught up by the Bolsheviks and engage in mass slaughter of tens of millions of people? And with the Nazis, how did the most educated, refined, scientifically sophisticated, technologically advanced, strongest power on earth at that time, how did it go off the cliff with the Nazis and end up with the Holocaust, the greatest evil ever perpetrated in the history of humankind, at least that we know about? How did this happen? You know, in the United States today, with the phenomenon of Donald Trump, you have something similar. You find echoes of the Bolsheviks and the Nazis. Here you have an obvious demagogue who lies and cheats and engages in all kinds of corruption, loses an election, but his grip on the Republican Party is so strong that even to the present day, in 2023, as we begin to approach the 2024 election in November of 2024, just over a year from now, not only does Donald Trump still control the Republican Party, but polling currently is showing that he beats Joe Biden. And there's 4 major cases against him, which total 91 different indictments. And it is sort of an incontrovertible fact that he's engaged in everything from sexual harassment and abuse to sedition and treason. And yet he is cheered. You know, and there's this old saying that you can fool some of the people all the time, most of the people most of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, the book, The True Believer, is about the people that you can fool all the time. All the time. So Erik Hoffer wrote this little book. And I have to say, as someone who reads a lot, as you all know, it's one of the most remarkable books, I think, that are out there in terms of understanding the phenomenon that currently grips much of the world. We saw with COVID, the public whipped up. Involuntary isolation. social distancing, wearing masks, and everybody was doing it. And anybody who didn't do it was an outcast, taken off of social media. That's a mass movement. And most of the people listening to this recording, this show, if you think back quickly about your experience of COVID, most people went along with the program. And the same with Ukraine, how the public has been whipped up into an anti-Russian, anti-Putin froth, Sturm und Drang, and we're fighting to the death in Ukraine. That's mass hysteria. That's a mass movement that's being carefully orchestrated. So I wanted to bring in COVID, and I wanted to bring in Ukraine, because most of us think, not me. Those were the Nazis. Those were those Germans back there 100 years ago in the 1920s and 1930s. Those were the Bolsheviks. Those were those people, over there in Russia. Not me. I'm educated. I'm rational. I couldn't be caught up in a mass movement. But remember what Jung said about mass movements. Mass movements are an example of mass hysteria. And the definition of mass hysteria psychologically is that everyone individually is perfectly normal. And as Jung pointed out about the Germans in the 1930s, where he first began to diagnose and to write about mass hysteria, they were completely ordinary, law-abiding people that went to church, loved their children, had picnics on Sunday afternoon, went on holidays to the Alps, and yet collectively, they were engaging in what can only be called insanity. When you systematically liquidate 6 million people just because of their race, that's insanity. And yet most Germans supported Hitler all the way to the end, just like they did in the Soviet Union, and just like they've done with COVID, and just like they're doing with Ukraine. So what I'm about to talk about for the rest of this session has to do with you, and it has to do with me. We're all susceptible. So we need to understand how a mass movement begins to develop and seize our soul with what Jung would call an archetypal mass formation. Because if we can understand it in ourselves, we can understand it more deeply when we look at, say, the Trump phenomenon happening right now in the United States of America. It's a mass movement. It's mass hysteria. And we need to understand it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to this book rather closely, because I find that Erik Hoffer's so brilliant. It's like reading the Tao Te Ching. There's some authors that are obtuse, like Kant, that you have no idea what he's really talking about. Heidegger, but there's some that are really clear and sharp and focused. And you read a sentence and you go, whoa, that was brilliant. Erik Hoffer is one of those people. So I hope that all of you will read it with interest. So he starts out, and this is a really important sort of underlying premise and observation that he makes. And that is, he says, this book deals with some peculiarities common to all mass movements, be they religious movements, social revolutions, or nationalist movements. It does not maintain that all movements are identical, but that they share certain essential characteristics which give them a family likeness. All mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for united action. All of them, irrespective of the doctrine they preach and the program they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful flow of activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and single-hearted allegiance. Doesn't matter whether it's a religious movement or a national movement or simply a mass movement. Structurally, psychodynamically, which means how they operate in the individual psyches, they're all the same. Though there are obvious differences between the fanatical Christian, he says, the fanatical Muslim, the fanatical nationalist, the fanatical communist, and the fanatical Nazi, it is yet true that the fanaticism which animates them may be viewed and treated as one. Now, that's a kind of a shocking statement, because we think of, evangelical Christians or Islamic fundamentalists as sort of similar. But what's the similarity between the Bolsheviks and the Christians and the Muslims and the Nazis when they get caught up in these mass movements? Erik Hoffer says it's all the same. It's just different exterior manifestations. So this is a beautiful sentence. There are vast differences in the contents of holy causes and doctrines, but a certain uniformity in the factors which make them effective. However different the holy causes people die for, they perhaps die basically for the same thing. That's really important to take in. And that's why, in the media, often you see commentaries of similarities between the Trump phenomenon and the Nazi phenomenon, because it's there. That wherever fanaticism in the form of a mass movement emerges and begins to seize a portion of the public, the psychodynamic structures in the psyche that are being activated are essentially the same everywhere. And it doesn't matter whether it's Europe or Japan. It doesn't matter whether it's, the 20th century or the 21st century, or as we'll see, back to the 18th century French Revolution, et cetera, or the Boxer Rebellion in the 18th century in China. It's all structurally the same thing. And that's actually sobering. And it's sobering because we tend to project in a condescending way, we could never do what the Nazis did. But the reality is we can, and we do, if the conditions are the same. Now, another point that he makes, which is really important, I think, is that for though ours is a godless age, it is the very opposite of irreligious. Just because you're secular, you can even be an atheist, doesn't mean you're not deeply religious. The true believer is everywhere on the march, and both by converting and antagonizing, he is shaping the world in his own image. And whether we are to line up with him or against him, it is well that we should know all we can concerning his nature and potentialities. And then he begins. And what I'm going to cover today in the really the few minutes that we've got is what is the appeal of these mass movements and who converts to these mass movements. And then next month, I'm going to talk about what unites a mass movement. What are the factors that would allow all the dissimilarity of individuals to come together with one purpose and one mind? It's really extraordinary phenomenon that we're dealing with. Erik Hoffer begins by saying that what catalyzes the beginnings of a mass movement are the following characteristics. At the heart is discontent. Discontent with the present, discontent with one's life, discontent with one's job, discontent with one's relationships, discontent with the world. That's a hard inner state to be in, this state of discontent. He says that while discontent is sort of that irritant in the oyster, that discontent by itself does not invariably create a desire for change. You know, you can succumb to depression. You can become suicidal, get caught up in anxieties of all kinds. He says there's other things that have to come into alignment with one's discontent to ignite a pathway into a mass movement. And one of them, he says, is a sense of power. And there are many people who are discontent, but they have no sense of power. You know, for example, the abject poor. They're so poor that there's no way even to lift their heads up. So even though they're discontented, they don't have any sense of power. So that's another aspect of what goes into the formation of a mass movement, is this notion of discontent combined with a sense of power. And some people get caught into an irresistible attraction to the power that is derived at stirring up the discontent. And the French Revolution is an example of this, according to de Tocqueville, the great historian of the 18th century, early 19th century. And he says, never had humanity been prouder of itself, nor had it ever had so much faith in its own omnipotence than during the French Revolution. You think of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. You think of Hitler and the Nazis. They got caught up in this sense of destiny, and we can transform this discontent. What? Third ingredient? Into a better future. So hope for the future is one of those necessary ingredients in any viable mass movement that endures over time and transacts major political and social transformation. Is that the leaders, the demagogues, can translate the discontent into a vision of the future for which the discontented are willing to sacrifice their lives. What is the logo or theme of the Trump movement? Make America great again. So it combines nostalgia of this wonderful time when America was great, ruined by the liberals, and woke consciousness and all those immigrants coming across the border, which we'll get into in more detail next time. And Trump is viewed by his followers as that leader that can deal with all these areas of frailty and weakness in contemporary society and make America great again. He says it over and over and over to wild applause to his followers. And then Hoffer makes just a side point, which is important, that the differences between conservatives and radicals isn't around their personality as much as their attitude toward the future. The conservatives, the reactionaries, are content with the present, or they're totally identified with the past. They don't see any reason to change anything. They're doing just fine. The radicals, the ones that seize a mass movement, say that the present is a disaster and the future is what will align. And then he makes an interesting point. When hopes and dreams are loose in the streets, when this mass movement starts to get going and it begins to become an attractor for all those discontented people out there, and they sense power to transform the present into the future. It is well, he said, for the timid folk to lock doors, shutter windows, and lie low until the wrath has passed. For there is often a monstrous incongruity between the hopes, however noble, however tender, and the action that follows them. It is as if ivied maidens and garland youths were to herald the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So that's another aspect of the mass movement. There's an inverse ratio between the grandness of the vision and the atrocities that they commit to gain the vision. And the grander the vision, the more atrocities are justified by the mass movement. And so if you're timid, you don't want to get into it, said Hoffer. When this starts to happen, bolt your door. Get out of Dodge. Get out of the city and hide yourself, because what's going to now happen is going to create hell on earth. And we've seen that in almost every mass movement. Just think of what would happen in America if Trump won the next election, as an example. And then he refines these points by saying, for people to plunge headlong into an undertaking of vast change, they must be intensely discontent, but not destitute. We'll get in that more later. And they must have the feeling that by the possession of some potent doctrine, infallible leader, or some new technique, they have access to a source of irresistible power. That's why the leader is so important. Lenin, Hitler, Trump, Robespierre, needs to be condensed in a movement. It can also be Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela. So there's these mass movements always require a dynamic, highly articulate leader that is able to crystallize this discontent, vision the future, and then give sanction to all the hatred and the evil that will now pour out as society is seized by the collar of the neck and transformed. And what is extraordinary, he says, is that the people who do this are not people of political experience. That's really interesting. Trump, Hitler, Lenin, no real political experience, never held office, never did anything. They came out of nowhere and blew the power structures away. Experience in a mass movement, says Hoffer, is a handicap. The men who started the French Revolution were wholly without political experience. The same is true for the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, and the revolutionaries in Asia. The experienced man of affairs is a latecomer. He comes later. He enters the movement when it is already a going concern. That's something that we see over and over in how we move into the psychodynamics of a mass movement. Now, I want to make a parenthetical point, which Hoffer makes about our modern societies. In a modern society, he says, people can live without hope only when they are dazed and out of breath by incessant hustling. The despair brought by unemployment comes not only from the threat of destitution, but from the sudden view of a vast nothingness ahead. The unemployed are more likely to follow the peddlers of hope than the handers out of relief. So if you look at the mass media right now and the fact that almost every aspect of our society has been commercialized through mass advertisement that is defining happiness as what you lack, and this product will give you what you seek. It's worth bearing in mind that this is not accidental. The elites are perfectly aware of the psychodynamics of a mass movement. And while they occasionally will generate hysteria, like with COVID or Ukraine, two just very recent examples in which most of us got caught up, they're also aware that the best way to keep a mass movement that they don't initiate in check is to keep people perpetually hustled, perpetually thinking that if they just get that next iteration of the iPhone, or I need a Tesla, and they get caught up in consumerist greed and fulfillment, that's a very effective way of keeping the lid on mass movements. It's extraordinary observation. And I think it's very generally true. Now he makes another point about the in terms of the interchangeability of mass movements, and he makes the point that in the 20s and 30s, you could be an ardent communist and then turn to being an ardent fascist almost in the blink of an eye. And that both the communists and the fascists in the 1920s and 30s were aware of this. And Captain Röhm, who was, remember, Hitler's brown shirt, the leader of the brown shirts, boasted that he could turn the reddest communist into a glowing nationalist in only 4 weeks. All mass movements are interchangeable. One mass movement readily transforms itself into another. A religious movement can develop into a social revolution, or a nationalist movement into a religious endeavor, and that therefore militant nationalism or a religious movement are actually interchangeable. And when I was back at the Harvard Divinity School, one of the professors there was a guy named Ralph Potter. And he had what he called Potter's box. And he says it's like a horseshoe. You have the extreme left here. You have the extreme right here. And most of us think that if you're going to convince anybody, you've got to get them to go all the way around the horseshoe to the other side. And you get your zealots on at the end of each horseshoe, and then it gets increasingly reformist and liberal and middle of the road at the top of the horseshoe. But he says that's not how social change happens. It flips to its opposite. The hardest people to move is this middle mush at the top of the horseshoe, because they really don't believe in anything. They just want an easy life. They're interested in the Tesla. The ones you can move are the extremes at both ends of the spectrum. And that's what the Nazis and the Bolsheviks both knew, and used that awareness in very, very effective ways in the 1920s and 1930s. And I see that I'm running out of time, but what Hoffer basically does through the first half of the book is then identify the kinds of people who come into mass movements. And he identifies 6 major categories of people. One is the poor, but not the poor who are abjectly poor, as I said before, but the poor who've recently gained in wealth. The period before the French Revolution was the first time in French history where the peasants started to experience higher standards of living. And that's what creates more discontent and hope. And so if you're recently poor, but you're now getting your act together, but you see all the inequalities that still exist in your world, you become very susceptible to a demagogue who says, come with me, and I can show you exactly how to create a future if we just eliminate those bad guys, whether they're Jews or communists or the Mexicans, people of color, all the people that are identified in this enemy formation then come into play, which I'll talk about in much more detail next time. And then you have what he calls the misfits. And the misfits, there's a great quote here. Just on the poor, he says, our frustration is greater when we have much and want more than we have nothing and want just something. We are less dissatisfied when we lack many things than when we seem to lack but one thing. Isn't that brilliant? Just ponder that for a moment. It's extraordinarily astute. He says it would seem then that the most fertile ground for the propagation of a mass movement is a society where, with considerable freedom, but lacking the palliatives of frustration. You know, the Weimar Republic, the Constitutional Assembly at the end of 1917, after the World War I in Russia, was maximum freedom. But the government didn't have the palliatives for frustration. People were frustrated. And the government couldn't solve that problem. So the frustration grew out of the freedom that they had. It's really amazing. And Robespierre, the great revolutionary during the French Revolution, said that what creates the true revolution was the despotism of liberty against tyranny. So a mass movement uses the instrumentality of freedom to destroy freedom. Fanatics, says Renan, fear liberty more than they fear persecution. It's extraordinary insights that he has. Those who see their lives as spoiled and wasted crave equality and fraternity much more than they crave freedom. If they clamor for freedom, it is but freedom to establish equality and uniformity. And then he makes another point in relationship to the poor. And then I'll start to bring this to a close here. He talks about that the group that are the most susceptible and the poor are those who are creative. Not the poor schmuck that just, is standing behind a plow and his horse, day in and day out, and goes home, gets drunk, beats the kids, and then goes to sleep and gets up and does it all over again. Those never make revolutionaries. The revolutionaries are among the creative poor. Nothing so bolsters our self-confidence and reconciles us with ourselves as the continuous ability to create. Creativity is just this extraordinary human capacity. The decline of handicrafts in modern times is perhaps one of the causes for the rise of frustration and the increased susceptibility of the individual to mass movements. Hitler was a struggling artist, for example. Lenin, had fantasies about being a creative writer. Tolstoy. Many of the early stages of a mass movement are led by creative, poor people without experience in political affairs, but a burning in their heart, which they experience as a great power, and they articulate it in such a way that they become a tractor for similarly motivated people to throw off their chains and create a future that eliminates all the people that they hate and is reserved for just their group in a new paradise. And I'll end there, although there's so much to be said. And just to conclude, there's also the selfish. They're the ambitious. They're the bored. He makes the point that one of the early adopters of revolutionary mass movements are mature women, unmarried, or married to completely boring husbands and are just waiting for someone to inspire them. Hitler was a master of this. Many of the early leaders in the Nazi movement were mature German women who either had never been married or were married to completely boring or lascivious husbands with whom they were completely estranged. And that's an interesting comment. I hadn't taken that in. The boredom is also a fertile ground. And then finally, the sinners, the people that engage in iniquity, thieves, rapists, fraudsters, murderers, people that have gone on to the dark side in whatever way. What becomes attractive to the mass movements is the way that the mass movement legitimates the very things that the conventional society punishes them for. And that's one reason why mass movements become so iniquitous, so dark and evil, is because they become a great attractor for people who've already given themselves over to the dark side. And that's why, as we're going to see next time, hate, violence, destructiveness is an essential characteristic of all mass movements that become, in the end, political or nationalistic. So I will leave it at that and now engage in some discussion. But first we'll have Georgie comment, as she always does. And then I want to see all the students here raise their hands because I'd like to get just whatever comments and discussion going with the students after Georgie makes her comment.
No, thank you, Jim. Brilliant as always. Absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to read this book. And I love this course. We always say this, you and I, that we always discover new books, and
Totally.
it is just amazing. I was actually thinking about that. What a childhood trauma he had by his mom dying and him losing his eyesight, then gaining it back. How did he become a sociologist? Like, wow. What an incredible person. My first question that how did this book affect you or influence you when you read it first time when you were 15? And how is the influence different now when you reread the book?
Well, just to share a little bit, when I was 15, I just had come back from Taiwan, where I was in a little school. I was speaking Mandarin Chinese with my little Chinese friends, and all of a sudden, I found myself in California in a junior high school of 1,200 students, grades 7, 8, and 9. And I was completely lost. I didn't know what I should do to cope with this cultural shock of going from kind of the rice paddies in this little 1950s Taiwan, very agrarian, almost no accoutrements of modernity, to California, USA, in the 60s, just south of San Francisco. So I was a little lost, and I picked up this book, and it happened to happen as it happened. My father was also talking to me. He was seeing that I was lost, and he said, Jimmy, you've got to exert power. The only way for you to deal with your alienation is become powerful. And I didn't even know what that meant. And he says, I want to encourage you to run for vice president of your class or student body president. So I thought, what a great idea. When I read Erik Hoffer, and he lays out that the way you build adherence is identifying problems in the present and then articulating a vision of a rosier future. I thought, what a great idea. And I started to do that, reading Hoffer and, then practicing at school and da-da-da. Next thing I knew, I'd been elected, I set out a game plan. I was going to be vice president in my sophomore year of the class. And then junior year, I was going to be president of the junior class. Then my senior year, I was going to run for student body president. And I did exactly that because I learned that people, all of us, are at some level discontent.
Mm.
So how you activate discontent, and in my case, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, in a positive way, not in a demagogic way, but what Erik Hoffer points out is the instrumentality between Gandhi and Hitler are exactly the same. Mm-hmm. It's just the enlightenment of the leader is fundamentally different. So you can create mass movements on the light side, which was my interest, but it works just as effectively on the dark side. But I learned a lot that I've applied over time to motivating people to create a better world. It's what we're doing at Ubiquity. That's what we're doing at Humanity Rising, because I think that discontent, sense of power, motivation for a new world is a very important catalyst for social change.
Yeah, for some people, because you know what I was thinking about that as you were talking, that what could be the trigger for people to switch off their critical thinking? Is it fear? We know that fear is a great driving force, or is it the survival instinct? Like when you were talking, when Hoffer was talking about that, why people are influenced and they become the followers. That what is it that when you said that there are in the pandemic, some people were following, some people were not following, as a subject. We all okay, but when we are in a group, we may do something that as a subject we wouldn't do. So what is that trigger? That's what I was wondering. Does Hoffer talk about it in the book? That where is that switch? Because these two things came to me: the survival instinct and the fear.
Yeah, I'll be getting into that more next time, but at the root of it, he would say is what he calls self-contempt.
Mm-hmm.
That people who are discontent in the essence of things they lack the confidence in their own ability to make the changes that they want. Mm-hmm. So they become susceptible to enemy formation. Blame the Jews, blame the communists, blame the Muslims, the Arabs or whoever. And that begins to create a unanimity among the in-group. That is, he points out that the more violent a group becomes, the more they need to self-seduce themselves as a group. Mm-hmm. So that's what Hitler's great genius was. You don't tell a little lie. You tell a big lie, because the bigger the lie, the more people need everybody else to believe the lie to justify the violence and the destructiveness that they transact in the name of the lie.
Mm. Yeah, no, I absolutely get it. But there is another point actually I would like to raise, which is connected to what I pointed out about the survival instinct or the fear. Is the psychology of humans wanting to belong to a community, right?
Yeah.
So belonging to a group, that means security, even though that even in most of the wars, there were so many people who didn't agree with the whole mission. but they didn't want to be outsiders because they were so afraid of standing up for themselves.
Exactly.
Because they know they can be killed, and
Yeah.
the ego is afraid of dying. So I think that's another element here, that even in the COVID, in the pandemic, people join not even thinking about it, whether that's right or wrong. They were just thinking because they want to belong to a group. And I think that's a personality trait differences, because there's so many people that are very comfortable of thinking that, sod it, I don't care what others think. I do my way, whether I belong to a group or not. So I think this is really important. I love this whole sociological view of things. I think it's incredible, this book. The other thing I wanted to mention to you, that when you were talking about leader and leadership, is being passionate. Remember the oratories of Martin Luther King and Hitler and Lenin and passion. You are super passionate, and that kind of like, that is such an energy that kind of like that pulls people with.
Yeah. Well, to your point, the German government forbade any audio recordings of Hitler after the Second World War, because even the sound of his voice could animate people. So it was illegal to put a voice and even images. It's beginning to break down now, but you don't find anywhere, at least that I know of, where there's, you can see little snippets of him speaking, but not over a sustained period of time, because of the impact of the tonality of his voice in inducing mass hypnosis. And so I think that's a very important point that you're making. And it's a mystery. It's really,
it is, and I think it's very complex. It's not just kind of like one thing what makes a leader so influential. Because look at Napoleon. He was the one who said he was riding his horse and he was going into battle. And it's not just kind of like his, because look at Hitler and Napoleon. They were both really bad speakers, public speakers, right at the beginning. Napoleon was stuttering, right? And Hitler wasn't really amazing at the beginning either. But something clearly has changed within in both of those men. So it is not just the voice, it's not just their speaking, but something that they did, that they were just so 100% self-assured. And I think that brings actually people who are not, who are low self-confidence. And that's what Hoffer is talking about, right? But there's the other thing actually, before we go to turn our attention to our audience, is that say more about what you believe in this using freedom to destroy freedom, because that kind of like grabbed me, what Robespierre said, right? So how is it that, like, of course freedom can be very subjectively defined, but still, that how one uses freedom. Tell me more, because I'm intrigued by this.
Well, he makes the point that let me see if I can find it quickly here. He makes the point that even the mass movements which rise in the name of freedom against an oppressive order do not realize individual liberty once they get rolling. So long as a movement is engaged in a desperate struggle with the prevailing order, or must defend itself against enemies within or without, its chief preoccupation will be with unity and self-sacrifice, which require the surrender of the individual's will, judgment, and advantage. And therefore, according to Robespierre, the revolutionary government was the despotism of liberty against tyranny, what Lenin called, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In order to get to the promised land, we need to be disciplined. You have to eliminate freedom and dissent, so that we can have the power and the unity to gain, the workers' paradise, or, equality, fraternity, etc. in the French Revolution. And yeah, those who see their lives as spoiled and wasted crave equality and fraternity more than they crave freedom. If they clamor for freedom, it is only as a tool to establish equality and uniformity.
Yeah,
right?
spot on. Yeah.
And so that's and he also makes the point, which is these are the misfits. Those who clamor the loudest for freedom are often the ones least likely to be happy in a free society.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then this is brilliant. Where freedom is real, equality is the passion of the masses. Where equality is real, freedom is the passion of only a small minority. Equality without freedom creates a more stable social pattern than freedom without equality. Let me read that again, everyone. This is Hoffer at his best. Where freedom is real, equality is the passion of the masses. Where equality is real, freedom is the passion of only a small minority. Equality without freedom creates a more stable social pattern than freedom without equality.
So deep and so spot on.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. So
Thank you, Jim. Now let's turn to our audience. Let's see if we
okay,
can get.
everyone, I want to see some hands up from some of our students in particular. Randy Cleveland, isn't he a student, Georgie?
Sorry. Hi, Randy. Great to see you, or rather hear you, hopefully.
Randy, do you want to say anything? Yan Jung, Shushu. Got to get some comments here from the students.
There is Randy. Randy, can you hear us? We can't hear you just yet.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Hi, what are your thoughts on these matters?
I found the whole thing was harshly real. The penetrating realism of his analysis was gut wrenching because I didn't realize the extent to which I fell into so many of the categories that he was tearing apart. In later, it was upsetting enough that I went and looked at some of his other work, and where he starts talking about the bright side as opposed to the evil, and he finds hope and compassion, which I found a relief. Did you want to talk at all about his thoughts about compassion?
Yeah, I was going to save that till next time, but just as a preview, I think first, Randy, thank you for your honesty. That it's like what Dante says in the Divine Comedy, that in his heart he knew that there was never a crime that he himself couldn't commit, and I think the awareness that you have of the point that I started with, that all of us are susceptible to mass movements. All of us live in a world of discontent, one way or another, and therefore are susceptible to advertisement, susceptible to spiritual schools of thought, etc. And to recognize that is very important just in terms of our inner awareness, but also in terms of the compassion that he speaks about. You know, I'll just use Georgie as an example because I know her very well, but she's a classic example of the kind of personality that Erik Hoffer says would never be seduced by a mass movement. Like whether it's COVID or Ukraine, just to take the food, she stood out because she's so self-reliant and self-confident. She maintains under all circumstances the ability to think authentically for herself. And that's what also, says Hoffer, is the wellspring of compassion, that true compassion is an antidote to the infection of a mass movement. So instead of demonizing others, you know, you love your neighbor as yourself. Instead of working to change the world violently, you aid the poor, you heal the sick, you teach in a compassionate way. So one of the things that Erik Hoffer over time in some of his other books, as he was reflecting upon it, he spent time talking about how one develops in your interior the capacities for authentic living. And one of the indicators of an authentic life is the capacity to be compassionate. That's why we see it so seldom. It's not so easy. Most of us are caught up in the consumerism. We're caught up in the insecurities that are being fostered upon us by mass advertising, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're oriented not by compassion, but by acquisition of those things who will serve as palliatives to our frustration. Very deep movement of the soul that he's talking about that is worth pondering. But Randy, you may have something else to add.
No, I'll wait until next week when you get into it in more detail.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. And just a quick question: where are you now? Alaska or North Pole, South Pole?
I'm a wildfire evacuee right now. There's about 4.5 million hectares on fire in the Arctic, and so I'm currently in the West Coast on a little place called Denman Island.
Randy, tell us more about the wildfires. These the ones that have been sweeping Canada?
Yeah, these are the ones in the Arctic north of Canada, and there's like I say, 4.5 million hectares. Right now, the temperature is 14 C higher than normal for this time of year, and the winds are atrocious, which is just pushing the fires all around. Anyway, 2/3 or 60% of the population of the Arctic has evacuated, and I'm among them.
2/3 of the population north of the Arctic Circle has been evacuated. Is that accurate?
Well, it's the Northwest Territories of Canada, which is north of the 60th parallel. So 2/3 are out. Now they're coming back in right now, just because there's been enough rain and it's getting cooler than it was. But the temperatures there have been excessive of anything that's been down here on the West Coast.
Wow.
Most of the summer. So it's just that I don't know where this. So I'm part of a mass movement. Getting out of
you
north.
were part of a mass exodus.
Yeah, mass exodus.
Although I think you were doing it for more physical, immediate reasons rather than
you got to be able
fires in your soul.
You got to be able to point a funny finger at yourself.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Well, I think we'll bring it to a close. I just want to add what Yan Jun Song put in the chat, that what I was talking about felt to her very applicable with China's contemporary history since 1919. Absolutely. This is Chinese history over the last 100 years, culminating even to the present day with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. So this is not a Western, German, American phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon because it applies to every human heart, every human psyche. So we will bring it to a close. Thank you, Randy. Stay safe, my friend. Thank you as ever, Georgie. Always good to dialogue. And then we'll see everybody the second Tuesday of October for the conclusion of Erik Hoffer's book with what enables a mass movement to unite. How do you take all these misfits, the sinners, the bored, the poor, etc.? How do you amalgamate them into a single movement that transforms the world? How does that happen? That's what we're going to talk about next time. All right, everybody, be well. See you next month.